This bread has been sitting in an oven for 2,000 years. The baker who slid it in there had 20 hours left to live. He did not know that. Nobody in the city did. It was an ordinary autumn morning in the year 79. Outside his door, neighbors were painting election slogans on the walls. A woman was scratching a love note into wet plaster. A dog pulled at his chain in a courtyard. Somewhere down the street, a man was arguing about the price of wine. Above all of it stood a mountain that had been silent for 800 years. Not one person alive had ever seen it angry. Most of them did not even think of it as a volcano. It was simply the green hill that made their wine taste sweet. By the next sunrise, every street, every oven, and every hand that held a stylus would be sealed under 20 feet of ash, and that loaf would still be sitting in the oven. Tonight, the fire and I will walk you through those 20 hours, hour by hour, street by street, until the mountain finally speaks. Hear that? That's my fire settling in, which means it's time. Pull up a chair and get comfortable. I'm Daniel Reed, and tonight we are not following a man. We are following a city. If you have sat by this fire before, you know we usually trace one life from beginning to end. Tonight is different. Tonight we have just 20 hours, and a whole city breathing inside them. Let's begin in the morning, while there is still time to smell the bread. Pompeii sat on the Bay of Naples like a jewel on a wrist. Roughly 11,000 people, by the best estimates, living in a city barely 2 miles across. Every wall told a story. Archaeologists have counted thousands of pieces of graffiti, election slogans, wine shop menus, love poems, and insults cheerful enough to make a sailor laugh. Roman senators kept summer villas along the bay. Fishermen hauled nets at dawn. Bakers, at least 30 of them, by the count of surviving ovens, kneaded and baked before the city woke. One of them pressed his name stamp into the dough, so customers would know whose bread they were eating. And behind it all, like a painted backdrop that never moved, stood Vesuvius, covered in vineyards, quiet, trusted. Some Romans did not even think of it as a volcano. It was simply a mountain, and it gave the wine a particular sweetness. There had been earthquakes, yes. A bad one 17 years earlier had cracked walls and toppled columns, and the city was still rebuilding. But earthquakes were ordinary here. The ground shook, you repaired the wall, and you poured another cup of wine. That is the quiet world we must hold in mind, because in a few hours it will cease to exist. Around midday on that autumn day, though for centuries the date was written as August the 24th, recent evidence points to late October. The mountain finally opened its throat. A column of rock, pumice, and superheated gas shot upward with a force that modern scientists compare to a nuclear blast. Within minutes it climbed more than 20 miles into the sky and spread outward like a vast, dark umbrella, or, as one ancient witness later described it, like a Mediterranean stone pine, a very tall trunk and branches fanning out at the top. That witness was a 17-year-old boy named Gaius Plinius, watching from the far side of the bay. We know him today as Pliny the Younger, and years later he wrote 2 letters to the historian Tacitus, describing everything he saw. Those letters are the only surviving eyewitness account of the disaster, and without them, we would be guessing at almost every detail. In Pompeii, the sky began to darken, and then the stones began to fall. Not boulders, but a steady, suffocating rain of pumice, hot, light, gray-white pebbles, piling up inch by inch, hour by hour, with no sign of stopping. Now came the choice that would divide the living from the dead: flee or shelter. Many did run. By most estimates, the majority of the population escaped during those early afternoon hours, clutching children, coins, jewels, whatever their hands could carry. But others stayed. Some believed the rain would stop, as earthquakes always had. Some were slaves, unable to leave. Some were old or sick, or simply refused to abandon everything they had built. A woman clutched a bag of gemstones. A gladiator sat in his barracks. A dog pulled at the chain that held him to the courtyard wall. By late afternoon, the pumice lay knee-deep in the streets. Doors jammed shut. Flat roofs groaned under the weight, and some began to crack and collapse. Darkness fell early, not because of sunset, but because the sky itself had disappeared behind ash. And out on the bay, through that unnatural night, a fleet of warships began to move. Their commander had read the column in the sky and made a decision that would cost him his life. His name was Gaius Plinius Secundus, Pliny the Elder, uncle of the boy on the terrace, and admiral of the Roman fleet at Misenum. He was roughly 60 years old, heavy, asthmatic, and quite possibly the most curious man in the Roman Empire. He had written an encyclopedia of the natural world, 37 volumes covering everything from astronomy to elephant behavior, by reading at every meal, sleeping as little as possible, and having a secretary read aloud to him even in the bath. When the column rose, he ordered his ships to sail directly toward it. Not away, toward. He had received desperate messages from people trapped along the shore, and curiosity alone might have driven him even without the pleas. Let's be honest by this fire. We do not know how much was rescue and how much was fascination. History has given him credit for both. By the way, Pliny sailed into danger so others could escape. This fire cost nothing. If you want a chair, buy it every week. Subscribe. Call it the cheapest rescue the Admiral never ran. His ships landed at Stabiae, south of Pompeii. The pumice was already too thick to leave. Pliny went to dinner, took a bath. Eyewitnesses wrote that he slept, or pretended to, and waited for the wind to change. The wind did not change. What came instead was worse than anything Rome had a word for. In the hours before dawn, the eruption entered its killing phase. The tall column that had held the ash aloft collapsed under its own weight, and what fell was not stone. It was a cloud, a wave, a boiling river of superheated gas and fine ash, hotter than a bread oven, moving faster than any horse could run. Modern science calls it a pyroclastic surge. The Romans had no name for it at all. The first surge struck the neighboring town of Herculaneum. People huddled in stone boathouses by the harbor died in a single breath. The heat was so extreme that, by later analysis, it killed faster than any nerve could carry pain. Then, around sunrise, the surges reached Pompeii. For those still inside the city walls, there was no running. The pumice was chest-deep in some streets. Doorways were buried. The air was black, choked with fine ash that turned every breath into a mouthful of powder. And then the cloud reached the walls. It did not burn the buildings, it simply filled them, room by room, like water filling a glass. In one room, a family huddled together. In another, a man shielded his face with his cloak. Everything stopped at once. On the beach at Stabiae, the admiral's body was found the next morning. Pliny the Elder lay on a cloth, as though resting. Whether the gas or his weak lungs took him, the witnesses could not say. His nephew wrote it all down, and those letters are the reason we know any of this at all. And then, silence. For 17 centuries, silence. The city slept under its blanket of stone. Farmers planted vineyards above it. Towns grew around its edges. The very name Pompeii faded from common memory. Then, in 1748, workmen digging a channel struck a painted wall, and the silence broke open. What they found was not a ruin. It was a city frozen mid-sentence. Wine still sat in jars. Bread still sat in ovens. A pot of soup hung over a cold hearth. Election slogans still shouted from the walls, campaigning for candidates who had been dead for 1700 years. And in the ash, the shapes of people remained, hollows where bodies had decayed, which later archaeologists filled with plaster to reveal the final postures of the dead. A mother curling over her child, a man covering his mouth, the guard dog, still chained, twisted at the end of his leash. Here is what the mountain could not destroy. The graffiti survived, and because it did, we know more about ordinary Roman life than any emperor's biography could teach us. We know what wine cost. We know which gladiator the girls preferred. We know that someone scratched into a tavern wall, as one translation reads, words that amount to the oldest pub complaint in the world. Bread survived, still scored into 8 slices, still carrying, in some loaves, the stamp of the man who baked it. You can stand in a museum in Naples today and look at that loaf through glass. The streets survived, with the deep grooves of cartwheels worn into the stone, and the raised stepping stones that let citizens cross the road without stepping in the mud. Ancient crosswalks, still perfectly placed after 2,000 years. Even the fast food counters survived, stone bars with round holes for heated pots, where workers once bought lunch the way you might grab a coffee today. And the mountain itself survived. Vesuvius still stands above the bay. Nearly 3 million people live within reach of its next eruption. It is not extinct. Volcanologists classify it as dormant, and it last erupted within living memory in 1944, when American soldiers watched lava swallow an airfield. What the fire shows us tonight is not about power. It is about what lasts. An emperor's palace crumbles. A baker's loaf endures. Ordinary things, sealed by accident in the right moment, become immortal. Remember the bread. A baker pressed his stamp into that dough on a morning when nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. He was not trying to leave a message. He was trying to make a living. And that, my friend, is the strangest truth the ash preserved. The things that last are almost never the things we build to last. The senator's marble villa is rubble. The baker's Tuesday morning loaf is in a museum. You are doing something ordinary tonight too. You are sitting quietly, listening and learning, word by word, sentence by sentence. Nobody will put this evening behind glass, but the English you are absorbing right now will still be inside you years from now, long after tonight's fire has cooled. Think of it this way. The senators of Pompeii built marble columns meant to stand forever. They are dust. A baker did his morning job, stamped his name into an ordinary loaf, and slid it into the heat, and it crossed 2,000 years without trying to. So keep baking. Keep pressing your name into the work. The mountain cannot touch what you carry in your mind. Ordinary persistence is the only immortality that actually works. Before the fire burns down, one question tonight. If you had 20 hours and could carry only one thing, what would it be? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me where in the world you're listening from. I read every single comment by this fire. If this story earned it, subscribe. You bring the chair, I bring the history. And next time, a different kind of eruption. No volcano, just hunger. In 1789, the people of Paris ran out of bread, and what followed shook every throne in Europe. A queen, a mob, and a blade that changed the meaning of the word revolution. Who lit the match? Pull up a chair and find out. The fire's still warm, and there is always a chair for you. I'm Daniel Reed, and this is Fireside History.